Greetings and welcome to the Geoff Matthews podcast, where the rubber meets the road. Tonight I want to talk about CCUS, carbon capture, utilisation and storage. When I first started looking into this subject back in 2016, I came to the conclusion that it was going to be needed in the end. That is, we would do everything we could to mitigate and get the big carbon emissions out of our processes and our energy systems, and the last bit that we couldn't get out, we would have to carbon capture. And in 2020, I co-authored a paper looking at primary aluminium smelting. It was entitled Pathway to Zero Emissions 2050, and it pretty much came to that conclusion. Get the carbon out of the energy systems and the very last bit of the process emissions, you would have to carbon capture. Now, fast forward to 2023, the IEA published their energy outlook. Now, usually that energy outlook gets published every year. I read it and yep, that's great, and I put it down, never think about it again. This year was different. This year it was a compelling document, 500 odd pages. Don't worry, I've read it, so you don't have to. And as somebody interested in the future, there was a lot of futurist stuff in there. And so one of those subjects that came back up was CCUS. And what it said was, we've actually blown past our deadlines that we needed, or our targets we needed to meet. And because of that, we're now so far behind. To keep the planet to 1.5 degrees, we're going to have to carbon capture on a large scale. And that means utilising it or storing it. And that got me thinking, and it has renewed an interest in the subject again, and I thought I'd put together this podcast. However, when I started looking in depth at it, I opened a can of worms, if you like, or a Pandora's box, if you like, and that this subject is really only getting going. And I think we're only scratched the surface so far. And so let's look at the surface. There's about 35 facilities carbon capturing at the moment. They capture around 45 million tonnes, which is more than I thought, by the way. There's somewhere between 200 and 300, I've read both figures, but let's take 200 projects in the pipeline that are meant to be delivered by 2030, and those projects would take out another 220 million tonnes. And the cost of that, the energy cost of that, we estimated to be about 880 terawatt hours, which is about a third of what the EU generates in power at the moment. So a third of the power production of the EU to take out 220 million tonnes. Is that a big figure or a small figure? Well, on a global scale, we emit 37 billion tonnes, and about 23% of that is absorbed by the oceans, and about 30% is absorbed by the lands and the trees on the land, leaving about 17 billion tonnes that goes into the atmosphere that's causing our global warming and our climate change. So of the 17 billion, that 220 is 0.7%. In fact, it's 0.7% of the 37. It's 1.9% of the 17. So 1.9% of what we've got for a cost of, the figures go from $100 a tonne to $1,000 a tonne. It's a large difference. But I think at the moment they're saying it's 750, which is $163 billion to take that 1.7% out of the atmosphere. And what wasn't mentioned is where's it going to be taking it from? Now, I'm not a fan of, and I don't think anyone who logically looks into it, of trying to keep coal-fired power stations alive by spending lots of money on carbon capture for them. There is a compelling, the energy cost is, you could argue that if you said to me, take the top 10 polluters in Europe, and we will lose a third of the energy that they're generating, but they won't emit any carbon, I think you'd do that deal tomorrow. But then you add the cost on, and then you start thinking, well, what could we do with that money? Couldn't we attack that problem from a different way and build renewables out and just get rid of them altogether? And the answer is, that's what we're going to have to do. You're putting band-aids on it, on those by trying to extend the life of those coal-fired power stations. However, there's a different argument for smaller plants that can mitigate, especially plant that's got no immediate replacements. We're talking here buildings in New York, heated by gas. There's a company called Carbon Quest that has built a piece of kit, pallet size, goes in the basement, takes the from the gas emissions, instead of that hot air including its carbon going into the atmosphere, takes that, cools it down, takes the water out of it, condenses the carbon, pipes it up to the street level, truck comes along, collects it, and takes it away. It's food grade. It could be used in the drink industry. They don't want to put it back in the atmosphere by putting it in our drinks. So they're looking at making cement, or putting it in the cement industry, made into concrete, stored long term. To me, that seems great. That's where the rubber meets the road. That's somebody doing something, because those plants have probably got, who knows what life they've got, and they may have another 20 years of life in them. So they're going to be emitting for another 20 years. We might as well capture that carbon now and stop 20 years of emissions. And obviously that piece of kit, if it's being installed, isn't the highest price. It can be afforded. And we should be applauding them for that, and I hope to interview them, by the way. So carbon capture on that level, yes, we should start doing it, because the only other options for those buildings at the moment is electrification into the grid, which is nowhere near decarbonised yet. And so we're putting more problems on a grid that hasn't even got there. So taking that carbon out, yes, I know it could be argued at extending the life of that gas production, but it's still mitigating CO2 today. And this is one of the problems that we've got as we're going forward. We can't just wait for the ultimate conclusion. We've got to start. We've got to actually start doing it now. And to me, that's starting on a small scale. Now, one more subject, because this is the piece going forward, and I hope to get some experts to interview them, is geosequestration. Geo meaning the oceans and the earth, how are they absorbing carbon naturally? They absorb more than 50% of what we emit. So how do we get them to do more? And that subject's something I'm really interested in. I've got a global expert, a professor lined up to interview soon. I hope to get them on in the next couple of weeks, and we're going to find out a bit more about it. Some of that, I mentioned a Pandora's box before. Some of it, when you look at that, can be a Pandora's box, geoengineering. What am I talking about? Spraying the upper atmosphere with sulfur to keep the planet, to drop the temperature of the planet by 1 degree. The problem is that one nation does that, it affects everyone on Earth. What's going to happen to food crops and the food chain? And is that going to start geopolitical wars? That's the Pandora's box on that side of it. But there must be some good ground. That's a pun. There must be some good ground there that we can look into, that maybe the planet can actually take a little bit more, and how do we help it? Thank you very much. Thank you for joining me. I know I didn't give you a lot of predictions for the future on this particular podcast, but we will keep our interest in this subject up, because I think it's going to evolve over the next decades. Thank you. Good night.